For his delight in this deluded state, he will fall into error, because he mistakes impermanence for permanence, and will thus become an adherent of Isvaradeva, the divine ego who creates all things, thereby screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the third state of the aggregate of consciousness, which sets up the causal mind as ultimate attainment, thus straying far from complete enlightenment, and standing opposite to nirvana, and so sowing the seed of perfection's opposite. As the practicer looks exhaustively into samskara, which becomes void, he will wipe out birth and death, but will not yet achieve nirvana. If he clings to his knowledge of his all-embracing consciousness, or alaya, and so sets up his own interpretation that all grass and plants are sentient and do not differ from men, and that after death men will become grass and plants. If he delights in such misconception, he will fall into error because of wrong knowing, and will become an adherent of the doctrine of Vasistha and Sani, thus screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the fourth state of the aggregate of consciousness, which sets up the knowing mind as ultimate attainment, thus straying far from complete enlightenment and standing opposite to nirvana, thereby sowing the seed of inverted knowing. As the practicer looks exhaustively into samskara, which now ends, he wipes out birth and death, but does not yet achieve nirvana. If he awakens to the uniformity of the 6 sense organs, as he contemplates the original transformation of the 4 elements, he may be tempted to worship the brightness of fire, the purity of water, the freedom of wind, and the creativeness of earth. He will regard them as fundamental causes of creation and as permanent reality, thereby falling into error because of his wrong view of creation. He will follow the teachings of Kasyapa and other Brahmins, and will, in his quest of immortality, offer his body and mind to serve and worship fire and water, thereby screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the fifth state of the aggregate of consciousness, which postulates the worship of the elements, thus throwing away the mind to pursue its objects and wrongly seeking the causes of fruition. He will thus stray far from complete enlightenment and will stand opposite to nirvana, thereby sowing the seed of inverted transformation. As the practicer looks exhaustively into samskara, which now ends, he wipes out birth and death, but does not yet achieve nirvana. In this state of bright and empty consciousness, he may be tempted to believe that voidness destroys all things, and will cling to annihilation as his last refuge. He will fall into error because he clings to nothingness, and so will think that devas without thought are void, thereby screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the sixth state of the aggregate of consciousness, which is completely void and mindless, leading to empty fruition. The practicer will stray far from complete enlightenment and will stand opposite to nirvana, thereby sowing the seed of annihilation. As the practicer looks exhaustively into samskara, which now ends, he wipes out birth and death, but does not yet achieve nirvana. In this continued state of consciousness, he may be tempted by its seeming permanence to try and make his own body deathless and free it from mortality. Such misconception will cause him to fall into error because of his wrong desire, and to follow the teaching of Asita Sri, who postulates longevity, thereby screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the seventh state of the aggregate of consciousness, which clings to long life and sets up the false cause of preservation in the search for permanent fruition. The practicer will thus stray far from complete enlightenment and will stand opposite to nirvana, thereby sowing the seed of false prolongation of life. As the practicer looks exhaustively into samskara, which now ends, he wipes out birth and death, but does not yet realize nirvana. In his contemplation of the aggregate of consciousness from which springs life, he may be apprehensive that its end will cause the total annihilation of the worldly. He will, by means of the power of transformation of Alaya, sit in a lotus palace and exhibit the 7 treasures and beautiful girls to give rein to his mind. He will thus fall into error because of his indulgence in falsehood, and will follow the heavenly demon, thereby screening his Bodhi nature and missing the Buddha knowledge. This is the 8th state of the aggregate of consciousness, which gives rise to the cause of worldly fruition. The practicer will thus stray far from complete enlightenment by standing opposite to nirvana, thereby sowing the seed of heavenly demons.